Subscribe to StoryLab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Trust. Leo Burke had built his life on three pillars: loyalty, honor, and family. At 35, he stood 6'2", with calloused hands that spoke of honest work and steel-gray eyes that had never lied to another soul. He owned Burke Construction, a company he'd inherited from his father and transformed into the most respected building firm in Millbrook County. Leo's reputation was spotless. The man who delivered every project on time, who paid his workers fairly, and who'd never broken a promise in his life. Mercedes Stratton had been the sheriff's daughter when Leo first met her at a county fair 18 years ago. She was 22 then, fresh from the police academy, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight and green eyes that seemed to see right through him. Her father, Harold Stratton, was already a legend in law enforcement. 30 years as sheriff, a man who'd cleaned up 3 neighboring counties and earned respect from every corner of the state. "You're going to marry that girl," Leo's father had told him after meeting Mercedes for the first time. "She's got steel in her spine and fire in her heart. Perfect match for a Burke man." The wedding had been the event of the decade in Millbrook County. Leo in his black tuxedo, standing tall and proud, while Mercedes walked down the aisle in her grandmother's lace dress. Harold Stratton had given her away with tears in his eyes, whispering to Leo at the altar, "You hurt my daughter, boy, and sheriff's badge or not, I'll bury you myself." Leo had looked the old man straight in the eye and replied, "Sir, I'd help you dig the grave if I ever did such a thing." Mercedes had climbed the ranks quickly, her father's reputation opening doors that her own competence kept wide open. She became the youngest police chief in the county's history at 32, just last year. Leo had been so proud, throwing a celebration party that brought half the county to their sprawling ranch house on the outskirts of town. Their children, Jordan and Lisa, were Leo's pride and joy. Jordan, now 16, had his father's build and his mother's sharp mind. Lisa, 14, possessed Mercedes' beauty and Leo's stubborn determination. Both kids excelled in school, played sports, and had never given their parents a moment's trouble. Leo's construction business had thrived alongside Mercedes' career. He'd won the contracts to build the new county courthouse, the expanded police station, and 3 new schools. His reputation for integrity meant that when Leo Burke's signature was on a contract, everyone knew the job would be done right. The Burke family attended church every Sunday, hosted barbecues for the whole neighborhood, and took family vacations to the mountains every summer. Leo coached Jordan's baseball team, while Mercedes organized the annual police charity drive. They were the golden couple of Millbrook County, successful, respected, and seemingly unbreakable. Leo had no way of knowing that his perfect life was built on quicksand, and that the woman he trusted with his heart, his children, and his future was already planning his destruction. Chapter 2. The Perfect Storm. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. Leo jerked awake to the sound of his phone buzzing against the nightstand. Mercedes stirred beside him, her red hair spilled across the pillow. "Burke Construction," Leo answered groggily. "Mr. Burke, this is Detective Ryan Clay with the state police. We need you to come down to the station immediately for questioning regarding an armed robbery that occurred tonight." Leo sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake. "I'm sorry, what? There must be some mistake." "No mistake, sir. We have evidence linking you to the robbery of First National Bank on Elm Street. We need you to come in now." Mercedes was fully awake now, sitting up and watching Leo with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What's going on?" she whispered. Leo covered the phone. "Some kind of mix-up. They think I was involved in a bank robbery." He returned to the call. "Detective, I was home all evening with my family. My wife can verify that. We'll need to speak with her as well. Please come in immediately, Mr. Burke." The drive to the station felt surreal. Mercedes sat in the passenger's seat, her police chief uniform hastily thrown on over her pajamas. She kept reaching over to squeeze Leo's hand, assuring him they'd sort this mess out quickly. "It's probably just a case of mistaken identity," she said. "Someone who looks like you, maybe using a fake ID with your name. Happens more than you'd think." Leo nodded, but something cold was settling in his stomach. When they arrived at the station, Detective Clay was waiting with two other officers Leo didn't recognize. Mercedes kissed his cheek before they separated him from her. "Don't worry, honey. I'll make some calls, get this straightened out." The interrogation room was stark and cold. Detective Clay laid out a series of photographs on the metal table. Grainy surveillance footage showing a man in a dark hoodie and cap pointing a gun at a terrified bank teller. "This was taken tonight at 11:23 p.m., Clay said. The perpetrator made off with $73,000 in cash. Leo studied the images. The man's build was similar to his, but the face was obscured. "I can see why you might think this resembles me, but I was home. I was watching the late news with my wife. Then we went to bed around 11. Funny thing about that," Clay said, sliding another photo across the table. This one was clearer, the robber's face partially visible as he turned toward his second camera. The resemblance to Leo was uncanny, and this was found in a storage unit rented under your name. He produced a plastic evidence bag containing a .38 revolver. Leo's blood ran cold. "I've never seen that gun before in my life. I don't even own a .38. Serial number traces back to a gun purchased by you 3 months ago from Morrison's gun shop downtown." "That's impossible. I haven't bought a gun in over 2 years." Clay leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Burke, we have surveillance footage, fingerprints on the weapon, and a storage unit rented in your name containing the money and the gun. We also have testimony from the bank teller identifying you from a photo lineup." The room seemed to spin around Leo. "This is insane. I'm being framed. That's what they all say." Hours passed in a blur of questions, accusations, and Leo's increasingly desperate denials. When his lawyer, Jonathan Roth, finally arrived, the damage was done. The evidence was overwhelming and seemingly airtight. "Leo, I'm going to be straight with you," Jonathan said during a brief private consultation. "This looks bad, really bad. Whoever set this up did a professional job. Someone is trying to destroy me, Jonathan. But who? And what? We'll figure that out. For now, we need to focus on bail and building a defense." The arraignment was a nightmare. Leo stood in orange coveralls before Judge Harold Matthews while the prosecutor read out charges of armed robbery, possession of an illegal firearm, and theft. The evidence seemed ironclad. When Leo's eyes found Mercedes in the courtroom gallery, she was crying, her father's arm around her shoulders. Bail was set at $500,000. Leo's construction business assets were frozen pending investigation. Jonathan managed to get him released on bond, but the damage to his reputation was immediate and devastating. Local news trucks lined the street outside his house. "Millbrook Construction King charged in bank robbery," screamed the headlines. Clients began canceling contracts within hours. Workers started looking for new jobs. That night, as Leo sat in his study, trying to make sense of what was happening to his life, Mercedes approached him with red-rimmed eyes. "Leo, honey, we need to talk." He looked up at his wife of 16 years, the mother of his children, the woman he'd trusted with everything. "What is it?" Mercedes sat down across from him, her hands trembling slightly. "The FBI contacted me today. They're going to want to interview me about your activities, our finances, everything." "Mercedes, you know I didn't do this." She was quiet for a long moment, studying her hands. When she looked up, Leo saw something in her eyes that he'd never seen before. Doubt. "I want to believe you, Leo. I really do. But the evidence. You're my wife. You're supposed to believe me without evidence." Mercedes stood up, her expression hardening. "I'm also a police officer, Leo. I've seen guilty men claim innocence 1,000 times." The words hit Leo like a physical blow. "You think I did this? I think you're in serious trouble, and I think you need to consider taking a plea deal." That was the moment Leo Burke's perfect life truly ended. Not when the police came to his door, not when he was arrested, but when the woman he loved more than life itself looked him in the eye and told him she believed he was guilty. Chapter 3. The Trial of Betrayal. The trial began 6 months later, in the very courthouse Leo had built with his own hands. The irony wasn't lost on him as he sat at the defendant's table, watching the jury file into the box he'd personally overseen the construction of 3 years earlier. Jonathan Roth had done his best, but the evidence against Leo was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, fingerprints, witness testimony, financial records showing he'd rented the storage unit. It was a prosecutor's dream case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, District Attorney Martin Moses began his opening statement. This is a simple case. A man who appeared to have everything: successful business, beautiful family, respected position in the community, decided he wanted more. On the night of October 15th, Leo Burke armed himself with a .38 revolver, drove to First National Bank, and robbed it of $73,000. Leo watched the jury's faces as Moses painted him as a greedy criminal who'd thrown away everything for money he didn't even need. 3 of the jurors had been to his daughter's birthday parties. 2 had hired his company for home renovations. Now, they looked at him like he was a stranger. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. The bank teller, Sandra Lee, took the stand and pointed directly at Leo when asked to identify her attacker. "I'll never forget his face," she said, her voice shaking. "Those gray eyes. I thought he was going to kill me." Leo's hands clenched into fists. He'd never seen this woman before in his life, yet she was describing him with perfect accuracy. The evidence technician testified about fingerprints found on the gun. The bank manager testified about the security footage. A handwriting expert testified that Leo's signature on the storage unit rental agreement was genuine. "Your Honor," Jonathan objected during cross-examination, "we've established that the defendant's signature appears on the rental agreement, but we haven't established when it was signed or under what circumstances." "Overruled," Judge Matthews replied. The witness may continue. When Mercedes took the stand, Leo felt his heart shatter completely. She wore her dress blues, her police chief badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. She looked professional, composed, and utterly believable. "Chief Burke, can you tell us about your husband's behavior in the months leading up to the robbery?" Mercedes glanced briefly at Leo, then focused on the prosecutor. He'd been under a lot of stress. The business was facing some challenging contracts, and he'd been working late many nights. "Did you notice any changes in his spending habits or financial concerns?" He'd been more secretive about money matters. When I asked about the business finances, he'd become defensive and tell me not to worry about it. Leo stared at his wife in disbelief. Everything she was saying was either a lie or a gross distortion of the truth. He'd been working late because he was personally overseeing the courthouse construction to ensure it met his standards. He'd been protective of business finances because he was planning to surprise her with a new car for their anniversary. "Chief Burke, were you with your husband on the night of October 15th? Mercedes hesitated for just a moment, so brief that most people probably missed it. But Leo caught it, and it confirmed his worst fears. "I was home, but I went to bed early that night. I've been fighting a migraine all day." Leo said he was going to stay up and watch the late news, but I can't say with certainty that he remained in the house all evening. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Jonathan leaned over to whisper in Leo's ear, but Leo couldn't hear him over the roaring in his head. His own wife, the woman who'd promised to love and honor him, was destroying his alibi and his life. The worst was yet to come. Harold Stratton took the stand on the 4th day of trial. Leo's father-in-law walked slowly to the witness box, his weathered face grim. He'd been like a second father to Leo, teaching him to fish, sharing stories of his law enforcement career, welcoming him into the Stratton family with open arms. "Sheriff Stratton," the prosecutor began, "you've known the defendant for 18 years. In your professional opinion, do you believe Leo Burke is capable of armed robbery?" Jonathan shot to his feet. "Objection. Calls for speculation and opinion testimony beyond the witness's expertise." "Your Honor," the prosecutor replied, "Sheriff Stratton has 42 years of law enforcement experience. I believe he's qualified to assess criminal behavior." Judge Matthews considered for a moment. "I'll allow it, but keep it narrow." Harold Stratton looked directly at Leo, and in those eyes Leo saw the complete destruction of 18 years of love and respect. "I've seen a lot of criminals in my time," Harold said slowly. "The dangerous ones aren't always the ones you'd expect. Sometimes the most violent criminals are the ones who've learned to hide behind a respectable facade." Leo felt like he'd been stabbed in the chest. This was the man who'd walked Mercedes down the aisle and place her hand in Leo's. The man who'd bounced Jordan and Lisa on his knee and called Leo son for nearly 2 decades. In your opinion, Sheriff, could the defendant have committed this crime? Harold's voice was steady and certain. Yes, in my professional opinion, Leo Burke exhibits the behavioral patterns of a violent criminal who's learned to mask his true nature. The words echoed through the courtroom like gunshots. Leo's children, sitting in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, both stared at the floor. Jordan's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Lisa held her grandfather's hand. That evening, Leo confronted Jonathan in the jail conference room. "They're all lying," Leo said. "My wife, her father, even that bank teller. This whole thing is a setup." Jonathan rubbed his temples. "Leo, I understand you're upset, but accusing your wife and father-in-law of perjury isn't going to help our case." "I'm not upset, Jonathan. I'm awake. For the first time in months, I'm seeing clearly. Someone orchestrated this entire thing, and it goes all the way to the top." "Who? And why?" Leo was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through the events of the past 6 months. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, Leo stood to hear his fate with the kind of calm that comes only from total devastation. "On the charge of armed robbery in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of theft in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." Judge Matthews sentenced Leo to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs moved to handcuff him, Leo looked back at the gallery one last time. Mercedes was crying, her face buried in her father's shoulder. Jordan and Lisa sat stone-faced, their eyes filled with a mixture of grief and shame. Neither of his children had visited him once during the 6 months he'd spent in county jail awaiting trial. Neither of them looked at him as he was led away in chains. Leo Burke, the man who'd never broken a promise, who'd built his life on honor and integrity, was branded a violent criminal and condemned to die in prison. But as the steel doors clanged shut behind him, only one thought occupied his mind. Someone was going to pay for this. All of them were going to pay. Chapter 4. The Education of Rage. Millbrook Correctional Facility sat like a concrete cancer on the landscape, surrounded by 20-foot walls topped with razor wire. Leo Burke entered its gates as inmate number 47291, just another lifer in orange coveralls. But from his first day inside, Leo knew this wasn't his end. It was his beginning. The first lesson came from his cellmate, a grizzled bank robber named Merle Erickson who'd been inside for 15 years. "You got that look," Merle said on Leo's first night, studying him from the bottom bunk. "Most fish come in here crying or trying to act tough. You came in thinking, what look is that? The look of a man who knows he got screwed and plans to do something about it." Leo lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling. "I was framed, set up by people I trusted." Merle laughed, but not unkindly. "Half the guys in here say that. But you? I believe you. Question is, what you going to do about it?" "I'm going to appeal. My lawyer says." "Your lawyer ain't going to do shit," Merle interrupted. "Courts don't like admitting they made mistakes. Appeals are for technicalities and procedural errors. You want real justice? You got to take it yourself." Leo rolled over to face his cellmate. "What do you mean?" "I mean you got skills they can't take away. You built half the county before you came in here. You know construction, electrical, plumbing, security systems. In here, that makes you valuable." Merle was right. Within a month, Leo was working in the prison maintenance department, fixing everything from broken toilets to faulty electrical systems. His reputation for competence and reliability grew quickly. Even the guards started requesting him specifically for complex repairs. But Leo's real education came from his fellow inmates. There was Todd Harris, a former police detective serving time for assault who taught Leo about surveillance and investigation techniques. There was Rich Burt, a computer expert convicted of fraud, who showed Leo how digital evidence could be manufactured and manipulated. And there was Salvador Hicks, an ex-military explosives expert, who taught Leo that sometimes problems required more direct solutions. The key to any investigation, Todd explained during one of their late-night conversations, is following the money. Someone went to a lot of trouble to frame you. That kind of operation costs serious cash. Leo absorbed everything like a sponge. He learned about forensics and evidence tampering from guys who'd been caught doing it. He learned about identity theft and financial fraud from experts who'd made millions before getting arrested. Most importantly, he learned patience from lifers who'd spent decades planning and waiting for their chance at revenge. The letters from home stopped coming after the first year. Mercedes had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting full custody of Jordan and Lisa. She'd moved out of their house and into a smaller place across town. Jonathan Roth delivered the papers personally during a visit. "She's also changing the kid's last name back to Stratton," Jonathan said quietly. "I'm sorry, Leo." Leo signed the papers without a word. His wife and children were dead to him now. All that mattered was the truth and the people who'd buried it. In his second year, Leo made a breakthrough. Rich Bird had been teaching him about computer forensics and digital investigation techniques when Leo remembered something from the night of his arrest. "Mercedes knew they were coming," Leo said suddenly during one of their sessions in the prison library. "What do you mean?" "The night I was arrested. When the call came, she was already awake. She got dressed too quickly, like she was ready for it." Rich nodded slowly. "Inside job. Your wife set you up. But why?" "We were happy. At least I thought we were. Money, another man, maybe both. Question is, who helped her?" Manufacturing that kind of evidence requires resources and expertise. Leo's mind raced through the possibilities. Someone with access to police resources. Someone who could plant evidence, manipulate witnesses, forge documents. Someone who could make a bank teller believe she'd seen Leo's face when she'd never met him before. The answer came to him in his third year during a conversation with Salvador Hicks about military protocols and chain of command. "Your father-in-law," Salvador said when Leo described Harold Stratton's testimony. 42 years in law enforcement, contacts throughout the system. He could orchestrate something like this. But why would Harold want to destroy me? He loved me like a son. Maybe he found out something about you that changed his mind. Or maybe he was protecting something else. Someone else. That night, Leo lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, pieces of the puzzle slowly clicking into place. Mercedes' late nights at work, her new focus on physical fitness, her sudden interest in new clothes and expensive perfume, the way she'd started taking her phone calls in private. She'd been having an affair. But with whom? And how had Harold found out? The old man was sharp, but he'd retired from active law enforcement 5 years ago. Unless... Leo sat up suddenly, his heart pounding. Unless Harold hadn't retired willingly. Unless he'd been forced out and was looking for a way back into the game. Unless Mercedes' affair wasn't just about sex, it was about power. The next morning, Leo requested a meeting with the warden. Warden Roland Matthews, no relation to the judge, was a hard man who'd spent 30 years in corrections. He knew Leo by reputation. The lifer who fixed everything and never caused trouble. "What can I do for you, Bert?" "I want to request access to the law library for research on my case. I also want to request permission to correspond with journalists about potential investigative stories." Matthews studied Leo carefully. "You planning something stupid?" "I'm planning something smart. I think I was framed, and I think I can prove it. But I need resources. And if you're wrong?" Leo met the warden's gaze without flinching. "Then I spend the rest of my life here anyway. But if I'm right, some very bad people are going to pay for what they did." Matthews was quiet for a long moment. "I'll consider your request." A week later, Leo received approval for extended law library access and limited correspondence privileges. He began writing letters to investigative reporters, cold case specialists, and anyone else who might be interested in corruption in small-town law enforcement. Most ignored him. A few sent polite rejections. But one letter reached Lucille Walters, an investigative journalist with a state newspaper who specialized in police corruption cases. "Mr. Burke," she wrote back, "your case intrigues me. I've done some preliminary research, and there are several aspects that don't add up. I'd like to visit you to discuss this further." Leo's first real smile in 3 years spread across his face as he read her letter. The game was finally beginning. Chapter 5. The Network of Truth. Lucille Walters was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that had seen through 30 years of lies, cover-ups, and corruption. She sat across from Leo in the prison visiting room, her digital recorder on the metal table between them. "I've reviewed your case file," she said without preamble. "The evidence against you is strong, but there are inconsistencies that bother me." Leo leaned forward slightly. "Such as?" "The timing, for one. The bank robbery occurred at 11:23 p.m., according to surveillance footage. But the timestamp on that footage doesn't match the bank's automatic backup system. Someone altered it." Leo's pulse quickened. "Can you prove that?" "I'm working on it. I also found it interesting that 3 key pieces of evidence, the gun, the storage unit rental, and the witness identification, all trace back to the same week in September, a month before the robbery. Someone was setting the stage." "Exactly. But here's what really caught my attention." Lucille pulled out a photograph. "This was taken at a police charity fundraiser 6 months before your arrest." "Notice anything?" Leo studied the image. It showed Mercedes in her police uniform, standing next to a tall man in a suit. They weren't touching, but their body language suggested intimacy. The way they angled toward each other, the comfortable proximity, the shared smile. "Who is he?" "Detective Todd Harris. He transferred to Millbrook County from the state police about 8 months before your arrest. He was the lead investigator on your case." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Mercedes hadn't just been having an affair. She'd been planning Leo's destruction with her lover. Todd Harris had the skills and access to manufacture evidence, manipulate witnesses, and coordinate the frame-up. "There's more," Lucille continued. "I did some digging into Harris's background. He was forced to resign from the state police following allegations of evidence tampering in 3 separate cases. No formal charges were filed, but his career was effectively over, until Mercedes gave him a new one, and Harold Stratton gave him credibility. The old sheriff's endorsement opened doors that would have been closed to Harris otherwise." Leo sat back in his chair, his mind racing. "Harold knew about the affair. He helped them. That's my theory. I think Mercedes and Harris approached Harold with their plan. Maybe they convinced him you were a threat to Mercedes somehow. Or maybe Harold was just old school enough to believe a cop's word over a civilian's. So they destroyed my life to protect theirs." Lucille nodded grimly. "But destroying you wasn't enough. They had to make sure you could never come back to threaten them. That's why they went for life, without parole, instead of just sending you away for a few years." Leo's hands clenched into fists. 3 years of planning and patience crystallized into cold, perfect clarity. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you can remember about the months leading up to your arrest. Every detail about Mercedes' behavior, Harold's attitude toward you, any interactions you had with Todd Harris." Over the next 2 hours, Leo walked Lucille through everything. Mercedes' late nights, her new wardrobe, her sudden interest in working out, Harold's subtle changes in behavior, the way he'd started looking at Leo with something that might have been pity. The few times Leo had encountered Todd Harris at police events, the man's overly friendly demeanor that had struck Leo as false. "I need access to financial records," Lucille said as their time ran out. "Bank statements, credit card bills, phone records. If I can establish a pattern of communication between Mercedes and Harris before your arrest, I can build a timeline. I can't help you with that from in here. You don't have to. I have contacts at the newspaper with resources you don't." "But Leo," Lucille's expression grew serious. "Even if I can prove you were framed, getting your conviction overturned won't be easy. The legal system doesn't like admitting mistakes this big." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because the people who did this to you are still in power. Mercedes is still police chief. Harold still has influence. Todd Harris is now deputy chief. They've spent 3 years consolidating their position." Leo smiled, and Lucille felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in that smile that spoke of patience, planning, and absolute ruthlessness. "Ms. Walters, I've spent 3 years in here learning from some very talented people. I know exactly what I'm going to do when I get out. And what's that? I'm going to destroy them. All of them. Not just their careers or their reputations. I'm going to take everything they care about and burn it to the ground. Lucille studied Leo's face carefully. That sounds like a threat. It's not a threat. It's a promise. After Lucille left, Leo returned to his cell with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his arrest. Merle was reading on his bunk when Leo entered. Good visit. Very good. My journalist friend thinks she can prove I was framed. Merle looked up from his book. That's great news. Appeal coming up. Eventually. But first, I need to prepare for what comes after. Revenge. Leo nodded. Comprehensive, methodical, and final. Merle swung his legs over the side of his bunk. You gonna need help with that? Maybe. You know people on the outside? I know people everywhere. What kind of help are you thinking about? Leo pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching a rough floor plan. Mercedes and Todd think they're safe because they control the law in Millbrook County. They think they've won because I'm locked up and my reputation is destroyed. But they made one crucial mistake. They left me alive, and they gave me time to think. Over the next several weeks, Leo refined his plans with input from his network of convicted experts. Todd taught him surveillance techniques and how to gather intelligence without being detected. Rich showed him how to access digital information and manipulate electronic systems. Salvador provided insights into tactics and strategy from his military background. The key is patience, Salvador explained during one of their planning sessions. You can't just charge in and start shooting. You need to understand your enemy's weaknesses, their routines, their relationships. You need to identify what they value most, then systematically destroy it. What if what they value most is each other? Salvador smiled grimly. Then you turn them against each other. Nothing destroys people faster than betrayal by someone they trust. 6 months after Lucille's first visit, she returned with news that made Leo's blood sing with anticipation. I've got enough evidence to request a formal review of your case, she said, sliding a thick folder across the table. Financial records showing payments from an offshore account to the storage unit company where the evidence was planted. Cell phone records proving Mercedes and Todd were in constant contact for months before your arrest. And most importantly, I found the real bank robber. Leo's eyebrows rose. What? Guy named Jeff Burnett. Career criminal with a record going back 20 years. He was arrested in Nevada 6 months ago for armed robbery using the exact same methods as your case. When I showed him the surveillance footage from your robbery, he admitted it was his work. He's willing to testify? For a reduced sentence, yes. The Nevada prosecutor is willing to deal because Burnett can help them clear several other cases. Leo felt a surge of vindication, so powerful it was almost overwhelming. After 3 years of being branded a violent criminal, the truth was finally emerging. How long until the review? Could be months, could be a year. The wheels of justice turn slowly, especially when they're admitting they ground up an innocent man. I can wait. Lucille studied Leo's face. What are you planning to do when you get out? Leo met her gaze without flinching. I'm going to reclaim my life. And your wife? Your children? Your father-in-law? They made their choices. Now they'll live with the consequences. As Lucille packed up her papers, she couldn't shake the feeling that Leo Burke's release was going to set something terrible in motion. The man across from her wasn't the same successful contractor who'd been railroaded 3 years ago. Prison had hardened him, educated him, and filled him with a cold fury that she suspected would burn for years to come. But that wasn't her problem. Her job was to expose the truth and free an innocent man. What he did with his freedom was up to him. Chapter 6, The Gathering Storm. The formal review of Leo Burke's case began on a cold February morning, 18 months after Lucille Walters first published her investigative series. The story had gained national attention, turning Leo from an unknown convicted felon into a symbol of prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption. Leo sat in his cell reading the latest newspaper coverage when Warden Matthews appeared at his door. Burke, you got visitors. Your legal team. Leo had assembled an impressive group of attorneys using the settlement money from a civil rights lawsuit against the county. Jonathan Roth was still his primary counsel, but now he was backed by a team of appeals specialists and civil rights lawyers who smelled blood in the water. The conference room was packed when Leo arrived. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, surrounded by legal documents and case files. "Leo, I have good news and better news," Jonathan began. "The good news is that Jeff Burnett's testimony yesterday was devastating to the prosecution's case. He provided details about the robbery that only the real perpetrator could know. And the better news? Judge Patricia Hamilton has agreed to expedite your retrial. She's also granted our motion to exclude any evidence that can't be independently verified." Leo nodded calmly. "Timeline, 6 weeks. Leo, I have to ask, are you prepared for what's going to happen when you're released? This has been a huge media story. Mercedes and Todd are claiming they were victims of a conspiracy to frame you for a crime Burnett committed. What about Harold?" Jonathan's expression darkened. "Harold Stratton died of a heart attack 6 months ago, right after Lucille's story broke and the FBI started investigating the police department." Leo felt a stab of something, not grief exactly, but a sense of incompleteness. Harold had been like a father to him once, and now he'd never get the chance to confront the man about his betrayal. "What about my children?" Jordan is finishing his senior year at the local high school. Lisa is a sophomore. They're both living with Mercedes. "Have they said anything about me?" "About the case?" Jonathan hesitated. "Leo, you need to understand that your children have spent 3 years believing you were a violent criminal. Even if you're exonerated, rebuilding those relationships won't be easy. I'm not interested in rebuilding anything. I want to know if they've shown any remorse for abandoning me. From what I understand, they still believe you're guilty. Mercedes has convinced them that Burnett is lying to get a reduced sentence." Leo's expression didn't change, but something cold and final settled in his chest. His children had chosen their mother over the truth. They'd rather believe he was a monster than admit they'd been wrong to abandon him. "What about the civil suit against the county?" "We're looking at a settlement in the 8-figure range. Mercedes and Todd will likely face federal charges for conspiracy and civil rights violations. The entire police department is under federal investigation." Leo nodded. "Good. What about assets? What's left of my business?" "The company is gone. Mercedes liquidated everything during the divorce proceedings. Your house was sold to pay legal fees. Your equipment, your reputation, your client base, it's all gone." "I expected that." Jonathan studied Leo's face carefully. "What are you planning to do when you get out?" "Start over." "Leo, I need to ask this directly. Are you planning to take any action against Mercedes or Todd?" Leo met his lawyer's gaze steadily. "I'm planning to rebuild my life and clear my name. Nothing more." It was a lie, and Jonathan knew it. But it was the answer Leo needed to give, and the answer Jonathan needed to hear. The retrial was a media circus. Camera crews lined the courthouse steps as Leo was transported from prison to appear before Judge Hamilton. He wore a simple black suit that Jonathan had brought him, his hair cut short and his face clean-shaven. He looked like the successful businessman he'd once been, not the hardened convict he'd become. Mercedes sat in the gallery with Jordan and Lisa, all three wearing black as if attending a funeral. Leo's eyes found them briefly as he took his seat at the defendant's table. Mercedes looked older, her auburn hair streaked with gray. Jordan had grown tall and lean, resembling Leo more than ever. Lisa had inherited Mercedes' beauty, but carried herself with a stiffness that suggested years of anger and resentment. None of them looked at Leo. The prosecution's case collapsed almost immediately. Jeff Burnett's testimony was detailed and convincing. He described planning the robbery, scouting the bank, and executing the crime with precision that matched every detail of the evidence. When confronted with the surveillance footage, he pointed out subtle details that only the actual robber could have known. "I cased that bank for 2 weeks," Burnett testified. "I knew the teller rotation, the security protocols, even which camera angles gave the best views. This Burt guy, he's just some contractor who got set up to take the fall." The forensic expert who'd originally testified about Leo's fingerprints on the gun was forced to admit under cross-examination that the prints could have been transferred from other surfaces. "Is it possible," Jonathan asked, "that Mr. Burke's fingerprints were lifted from something else he'd touched and then transferred to the weapon?" "Technically, yes, though it would require considerable expertise. the kind of expertise a police detective might possess. Objection, the prosecutor shouted. Sustained, Judge Hamilton ruled. But the point had been made. The most damaging testimony came from a digital forensics expert who'd examined the bank surveillance system. The timestamp on the footage was altered, he testified. The original recording shows the robbery occurring at 10:47 p.m., not 11:23 p.m., as previously claimed. The alteration was made using professional editing software. By the third day of trial, it was clear that Leo's conviction would be overturned. The prosecution offered to drop all charges in exchange for Leo's agreement not to pursue civil rights violations against individual officers. Absolutely not, Leo told Jonathan during a recess. I want full exoneration. I want them to say in open court that I was innocent. Leo, this deal gets you out today. If we go to verdict, there's always a chance. No deals. I want the jury to say I was innocent. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, Leo stood to hear the words that had taken him 4 years to achieve. On all charges, we find the defendant not guilty. Judge Hamilton's voice was clear and strong as she addressed the courtroom. Mr. Burke, the court wishes to express its profound regret for the miscarriage of justice you have suffered. You are hereby exonerated of all charges and free to go. Leo nodded once, his expression unchanged. He turned to look at the gallery, where Mercedes sat with tears streaming down her face. Jordan stared at the floor, his shoulders shaking. Lisa looked directly at Leo for the first time in 4 years, her face a mask of confusion and grief. As the bailiff removed Leo's shackles for the final time, he made eye contact with each member of his former family. There was no forgiveness in his gray eyes, no hint of the man who'd once loved them more than life itself. Leo Burke walked out of the courthouse a free man, but the husband and father they'd once known was gone forever. Outside, reporters surrounded him with cameras and microphones. Leo held up one hand for silence. I want to thank the jury for finding the truth, and I want to thank Judge Hamilton for her fair handling of this case. I also want to thank investigative journalist Lucille Walters for her courage in exposing the corruption that destroyed my life. Mr. Burke, what are your plans now? Leo smiled, and several reporters later described it as the most chilling expression they'd ever seen. I'm going to start living again. I have a lot of lost time to make up for. Will you be seeking reconciliation with your family? I have no family. That ended 4 years ago when they chose to believe lies over truth. What about the people who framed you? Do you plan to pursue civil action? Leo's smile widened slightly. Justice takes many forms. Some of it happens in courtrooms. Some of it happens in other places. As Leo walked down the courthouse steps a free man, he pulled a sealed envelope from his jacket pocket. The same envelope he'd prepared in prison 6 months earlier, when Lucille first told him about Jeff Burnett's confession. Everything he needed for what came next was already in motion. He'd spent 4 years planning, learning, and preparing. Now it was time to collect what was owed to him. Mercedes, Todd, and everyone who'd participated in destroying his life were about to learn that some debts could never be forgiven, and some men, once betrayed, never forgot. Chapter 7. The Reckoning Begins. Leo Burke stood in the parking lot of the Millbrook Motor Lodge, the same place he'd stayed during his trial 4 years earlier. He'd checked in under a false name and paid cash for a month in advance. The room was Sparta, a bed, a desk, and a chair. Perfect for a man who'd learned to live with nothing. The envelope he'd carried from the courthouse lay open on the desk, its contents spread before him like a battle plan. 4 years of planning, networking, and careful preparation had led to this moment. The first item was a list of names with detailed personal information. Mercedes Burke, now going by Mercedes Stratton again. Todd Harris, recently promoted to police chief after Mercedes' stress-related resignation, following Leo's exoneration. Jordan and Lisa Stratton, his former children who'd chosen their mother's lies over their father's truth. The second item was a collection of photographs taken by a private investigator Leo had hired 6 months ago through intermediaries. Mercedes and Todd at dinner. Mercedes and Todd entering a hotel together. Mercedes and Todd house hunting in the upscale part town. They've been living their perfect life while Leo rotted in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The third item was a detailed financial analysis of every asset Mercedes had obtained through their divorce. The house, the cars, the bank accounts, all built on the foundation of his destroyed life. The fourth item was a military personnel file for Todd Harris, obtained through contacts Leo had made in prison. Harris had been dishonorably discharged from the Army for assault and had a history of violence against women. This information had somehow been sealed when he applied to the police force. The fifth and final item was a single business card, Halstar Private Security Solutions. Hal was an ex-Special Forces operative who'd served time for weapons trafficking. He was also one of the most dangerous men Leo had ever met, and for the right price, he was willing to provide very specialized services. Leo's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he'd memorized but never called. "Hello, Leo." Mercedes' voice was older, more fragile than he remembered. "Mercedes, I want to call you, to talk about everything that happened." Leo said nothing. "Leo, please. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but we need to talk about the children, about our family." "I don't have a family. Jordan and Lisa are still your children. They're confused and hurting. This whole situation has been devastating for them. They made their choice when they decided I was guilty without evidence. They made their choice when they never visited me in prison. They made their choice when they changed their names." Mercedes' voice cracked. "They were children, Leo. They were scared and confused. Harold convinced them. Harold is dead. What's your excuse now?" Silence stretched between them for a long moment. "I want to make this right," Mercedes finally said. "You can't. For years ago, you could have made it right by telling the truth. For years ago, you could have made it right by standing by your husband. Now it's too late. Leo, please. Todd and it's over. I ended things with him when I found out what he'd done. When I realized he'd used me to frame you." Leo laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "You're lying. My investigator has photographs of you and Todd from last week. You're shopping for houses together." Mercedes gasped. "You're having me watched? I'm protecting my interests." "What interests? What do you want from me?" "Nothing you can give me. You already took everything that mattered." "Then what?" Leo hung up. An hour later, his phone rang again. This time it was Jordan. "Dad." The word hit Leo like a physical blow. He hadn't heard his son's voice in 4 years. "What do you want?" Mom said you two talked. She's pretty upset. Is that why you're calling? To defend her?" Jordan was quiet for a moment. "I'm calling because I want to understand what happened. The trial, all that evidence that you were innocent. I don't know what to believe anymore." "You believe what you want to believe. You always have. That's not fair. I was 16 when you were arrested. A kid. I believe what everyone told me. And now? You're 20 now. What do you believe?" Another pause. "I think maybe we were wrong about you. I think maybe you didn't rob that bank. Maybe." "Dad, I want to try to fix this. I want to have a relationship with you again." Leo felt something crack inside his chest, but when he spoke, his voice remained steady. "Where were you when I needed you? Where were you during the trial, during the appeals, during the 4 years I spent in prison for something I didn't do? I was scared. I was confused. I was a kid who... You were my son. That should have been enough." Leo hung up. The third call came from Lisa 20 minutes later. "I hate you," she said without preamble. "Good. That's honest at least. You're destroying Mom. She's barely eating, barely sleeping. She knows she made mistakes, but she's trying to make up for them. Some mistakes can't be fixed. She was trying to protect us. Harold convinced her that you were dangerous, that you'd hurt us if she didn't cooperate. So she chose to destroy me instead. She was scared." Lisa shouted. "Harold had evidence that you were cheating, that you were involved with criminals, that you were planning to leave us. He showed her photos, documents, recordings." Leo sat up straighter. "What kind of recordings?" "Phone calls. You talking to other women, talking about leaving town, talking about getting rid of problems." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Harold hadn't just helped frame Leo. He'd been manipulating Mercedes for months beforehand, preparing her to believe the worst about her husband. "Lisa, those recordings were fake. All of it was fake. Harold was working with Todd to break up our family. You're lying. Why would I lie? I've already been exonerated. I have nothing left to lose. Lisa was quiet for a long moment. Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. You still abandoned us. You could have fought for us, tried to explain, tried to. I spent 4 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. My wife divorced me, my children disowned me, and my father-in-law branded me a violent criminal in open court. What exactly was I supposed to fight for? Us. Your family. My family died the day you all decided I was guilty. Leo hung up and turned off his phone. That night, he met Hal Starr at a diner outside of town. Hal was a compact man with scarred hands and eyes that had seen too much violence. They sat in a corner booth, speaking in low voices. You sure about this? Hal asked after Leo outlined his plan. I'm sure. Once this starts, there's no going back. These people will know you're coming for them. Good. I want them to know. Hal nodded slowly. What's the timeline? I want to start tomorrow. Mercedes first, then Todd, then anyone else who participated in destroying my life. And the kids? Leo's expression hardened. They're adults now. They made their choices. You want them hurt. I want them to understand the consequences of betrayal. I want them to learn that some things can never be forgiven. Hal studied Leo's face in the dim light of the diner. You know, there's no coming back from this road. I've been dead for 4 years. This is just making it official. The next morning, Mercedes found her car windows smashed and her tires slashed. A note on the windshield read, "This is just the beginning." Todd Harris arrived at work to find his office ransacked and his personnel files scattered across the floor. Nothing was missing, but someone had clearly been looking for something specific. Jordan discovered that someone had accessed his college email account and sent embarrassing messages to his professors and classmates. Lisa found that her social media accounts had been hacked and filled with humiliating content. The message was clear. Leo Burke was free, and he was done being the victim. The war for Millbrook County had begun. Chapter 8, The Unraveling. Mercedes sat in her kitchen at 3 a.m., a cup of cold coffee in her shaking hands. The phone calls had started at midnight, heavy breathing, then silence. Her security system had been triggered 4 times, but the cameras showed nothing. Someone was playing games with her, and she knew exactly who it was. Her phone rang again. This time she answered on the first ring. What do you want, Leo? Justice. I've lost everything. My job, my reputation, my peace of mind. Isn't that enough? Not even close. The line went dead. Mercedes slumped in her chair, tears streaming down her face. She tried calling Todd, but his phone went straight to voicemail. She tried calling her children, but neither would answer. She was completely alone. Todd Harris paced his apartment, a loaded .38 in his hand. Someone had been in his home while he was at work. Nothing taken, but his belongings had been carefully moved just enough to let him know they'd been searched. His backup gun was missing from his bedroom safe, along with several sensitive police files. His career was over. The federal investigation had found enough evidence to charge him with conspiracy, civil rights violations, and evidence tampering. His trial was set for next month, and his lawyer had already told him to expect significant prison time. But prison was the least of his worries now. Leo Burke was free, and Todd knew what kind of man Leo had become during his time inside. The inmates who'd helped Leo plan his revenge weren't the type to forgive and forget. Todd's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Check your front door. He crept to the window and peered through the blinds. A large manila envelope sat on his doorstep. Todd waited 10 minutes, watching for any sign of movement, before carefully opening the door and retrieving the package. Inside were copies of his military records. The real ones, not the sanitized version he'd used to get his police job. Details of his dishonorable discharge, his history of violence, his connections to several unsolved assaults during his time in the service. A note was paper-clipped to the front. Tomorrow morning, every newspaper in the state gets a copy. Unless. Todd's hands trembled as he read the rest of the note. Midnight. The old quarry outside town. Come alone. Bring your service weapon. Jordan Burke, he refused to think of himself as Jordan Stratton anymore, sat in his dorm room reading the news coverage of his father's exoneration for the 100th time. The evidence of Leo's innocence was overwhelming. Jeff Burnett's confession, the digital forensics proving the surveillance footage had been altered, the revelation that his mother and Todd had been having an affair throughout the investigation. His father had been innocent. Completely, undeniably innocent. And Jordan had abandoned him. The guilt was eating him alive. For 4 years, he told himself that his father was a violent criminal who'd chosen money over family. It had been easier than admitting he'd been wrong, easier than acknowledging that he'd failed the most important test of loyalty in his life. Now his father wouldn't take his calls. The man who'd taught him to throw a baseball, who'd helped him with homework every night, who'd been at every game and every school event, wanted nothing to do with him. Jordan had tried going to the motel where his father was staying, but Leo had refused to see him. He'd written letters that went unanswered. He'd even asked his mother to intervene, but Mercedes was dealing with her own crisis. The worst part was understanding that his father was right. Jordan was 20 years old now, old enough to have questioned the evidence, old enough to have visited his father in prison, old enough to have shown some loyalty when it mattered. Instead, he'd chosen the easy path. And now it was too late. Lisa was having her own reckoning. Unlike Jordan, she wasn't consumed by guilt. She was consumed by rage. Her father had been innocent, which meant her entire adolescence had been built on a lie. Her mother had cheated on her father, conspired to frame him, and then spent 4 years playing the victim while Leo rotted in prison. But Lisa's anger wasn't directed just at her mother. It was directed at her father too, for refusing to forgive them, for refusing to understand that they'd been manipulated and lied to, for abandoning his own children because they'd made a mistake. She'd always been Leo's little girl, the one who could make him smile with a single hug. Now he looked at her like she was a stranger, or worse, like she was an enemy. Lisa had inherited Leo's stubborn streak and Mercedes' fierce pride. If her father wanted to write her off, fine. She didn't need him anyway. She'd survived 4 years believing he was a criminal. She could survive the rest of her life without him. But late at night, alone in her bedroom, she cried for the father she'd lost twice. Once when she believed he was guilty, and again when she'd learned he was innocent. At 11:45 p.m., Todd Harris drove his pickup truck to the abandoned quarry where he'd spent his teenage years drinking beer and avoiding his problems. The place looked exactly the same, a deep pit carved out of the hillside, surrounded by rusted equipment and abandoned trailers. Leo's rental car was already there, parked at the edge of the access road. Todd could see a figure standing near the quarry's edge, silhouetted against the stars. Todd got out of his truck, his service weapon holstered but accessible. He walked slowly toward the figure, his heart pounding. Leo turned, and Todd was shocked by the change in the man. 4 years in prison had transformed the soft-spoken contractor into something harder, more dangerous. Leo's gray eyes held no warmth, no hint of the man who'd once hired Todd's cousin for construction work. "You came. What do you want?" Leo smiled, and Todd felt his blood turn to ice. "I want to offer you a choice." "What kind of choice?" Leo held up a manila envelope. "This contains everything I've learned about your time in the military. The assaults you covered up, the weapons you stole and sold, the civilians you killed in Iraq." Todd's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "I wouldn't," Leo said calmly. "You're outnumbered." Todd looked around frantically, but saw nothing in the darkness. Still, something in Leo's voice convinced him to keep his hands visible. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand what you took from me. For years of my life. My marriage. My children. My business. My reputation. Everything. Leo, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean much now, but I'm sorry. Mercedes, she convinced me that you were cheating on her, that you were planning to leave her and the kids. Harold showed us evidence. Harold was your partner in this. Harold was trying to protect his daughter." Leo took a step closer. Harold was a bitter old man who couldn't stand the thought of his daughter being happy with someone he couldn't control. "You were just the tool he used to destroy me." Todd backed up instinctively. "What do you want from me?" Leo held up the envelope again. "Confession. Full confession. Everything you did, everyone who helped you, every detail of how you framed me. And if I don't, then tomorrow morning, Every newspaper in the country gets copies of your real military records. Your federal trial becomes the least of your problems. You're blackmailing me. I'm offering you a chance to do the right thing for once in your miserable life. Todd was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. If I confess, what happens to Mercedes? Mercedes made her choice. Now she lives with the consequences. She was a victim too, Leo. Harold manipulated her. Mercedes was an adult who chose to believe lies about her husband rather than trust the man she'd lived with for 16 years. She was a police officer who participated in framing an innocent man. She was a mother who turned her children against their father. Leo's voice remained calm, but Todd could hear the fury underneath. She wasn't a victim. She was a co-conspirator. And the kids, Jordan and Lisa, are adults now. They can make their own choices about how to live with what they've done. Todd pulled out his phone and activated the recording function. If I do this, I want your word that you won't come after me physically. You have my word. Todd stared at the phone for a long moment, then began to speak. My name is Detective Todd Harris, badge number 4729. I am making this confession voluntarily and without coercion. 4 years ago, I conspired with Sheriff Harold Stratton and Police Chief Mercedes Burke to frame Leo Burke for armed robbery. For the next 30 minutes, Todd detailed every aspect of the conspiracy. How Harold had approached him with the plan to frame Leo. How Mercedes had provided inside information about Leo's schedule and habits. How they'd planted evidence, manipulated witnesses, and coordinated their stories. When he finished, Leo took the phone and uploaded the confession to a secure cloud server. Thank you for your honesty, Leo said. It won't save you from federal prison, but it might help you sleep better. What happens now? Leo smiled that cold smile again. Now you disappear. Tonight. Leave town, leave the state, and don't come back. Because if I see you again, if you try to contact Mercedes or my children, if you so much as drive through Millbrook County, our agreement is void. And if I don't leave, Leo's hand moved to his jacket pocket. Then we handle this a different way. Todd nodded, understanding perfectly. He walked back to his truck on unsteady legs, started the engine, and drove away into the darkness. He would never see Millbrook County again. As Todd's taillights disappeared down the access road, Leo pulled out his phone and sent the confession recording to Lucille Walters, the district attorney's office, and the FBI. By morning, the final piece of the conspiracy would be exposed, and Mercedes would have nowhere left to hide. The reckoning was almost complete. Chapter 9. The Final Judgment. The news broke at 6 a.m. Todd Harris's confession played on every television station in the state, while newspaper headlines screamed, "Police conspiracy exposed, an innocent man framed by corrupt cops." Mercedes watched the coverage from her kitchen, her face pale as ash. Todd's recorded voice filled her home, detailing every aspect of their conspiracy with clinical precision. When he got to the part about her providing Leo's schedule and personal information to help them frame him, Mercedes turned off the television and vomited in the sink. Her phone had been ringing constantly since dawn. Reporters, federal agents, lawyers, and curiosity seekers all wanted a statement from the disgraced former police chief. She'd stopped answering hours ago. At 9 a.m., there was a knock at her door. Through the peephole, Mercedes saw Leo standing on her porch, wearing the same black suit he'd worn to his retrial. He looked composed, patient, like a man who had all the time in the world. Mercedes opened the door, but left the chain lock engaged. "What do you want?" "To talk. One last time. I have nothing to say to you." "Then listen." Leo's gray eyes were calm, but Mercedes could see the controlled fury burning beneath the surface. "You destroyed my life based on lies and manipulation. You turned my children against me. You took everything I built and ground it into dust. Leo, please. I'm not finished." His voice cut through her plea like a blade. "For 4 years, I've thought about this moment. What I would say to you when I finally had the chance. Do you know what I realized?" Mercedes shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I realized that you're not worth my hatred. You're not worth my time. You're not worth the energy it would take to destroy you. I know I hurt you. You didn't hurt me, Mercedes. You killed me. The man who loved you, who trusted you, who would have died for you. That man is gone. You murdered him as surely as if you'd put a bullet in his head. Mercedes sobbed, but Leo's expression didn't change. I'm not going to destroy you. I don't need to. You've already destroyed yourself. You've lost your career, your reputation, your children's respect. You'll spend the next decade in federal prison. And when you get out, you'll be a middle-aged ex-con with nothing and no one. Leo stepped closer to the door. But I want you to remember something while you're sitting in that cell. I want you to remember that you chose this. Every day, for 4 years, you chose to let an innocent man rot in prison. Every day, you chose to believe Harold's lies over your husband's truth. Every day, you chose Todd Harris over the father of your children. I was scared, Mercedes whispered. I was confused. Harold had evidence. Harold had fabricated evidence, and you knew it. Deep down, you knew it, but you chose to believe it anyway because it was easier than admitting you'd fallen for a con man. Leo pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. This is a copy of Todd's full confession. In it, he admits that you knew the evidence against me was manufactured. He admits that you helped him plan the timing of my arrest. He admits that you suggested using the storage unit because you knew I'd rented one there for business equipment. Mercedes stared at the envelope in horror. That's not true. It's all true. And by noon today, every news outlet in the country will have a copy. Leo turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mercedes? I'm taking the children's college funds. Every penny. Consider it partial payment for 4 years of my life. You can't do that. I can and I will. I'm still their father legally, which gives me access to the accounts I set up for them. By the time you get out of prison, they'll be old enough to understand why I did it. Mercedes collapsed against the doorframe as Leo walked away. She tried to call after him, but no words came. She could only watch as the man she'd once loved, the man she'd destroyed, disappeared from her life forever. At Millbrook County College, Jordan was packing his dorm room when campus security arrived with 2 federal agents. They informed him that his financial aid had been revoked and his tuition account was empty. When Jordan tried to call his mother, her phone went straight to voicemail. The news coverage made everything clear. His father had emptied the college accounts for both him and Lisa. Every penny their parents had saved for their education was gone. Jordan sat on his stripped dorm bed, surrounded by boxes of his belongings, and finally understood the true cost of betrayal. His father wasn't just cutting them off financially. He was forcing them to understand what it felt like to lose everything in a single day. Lisa received the news at her high school, where a guidance counselor gently explained that her college prospects had just evaporated. With her mother facing federal charges and her education fund gone, Lisa's carefully planned future crumbled in minutes. That afternoon, she drove to the Millbrook Motor Lodge and demanded to see her father. The desk clerk reluctantly called Leo's room. Let her up, Leo said. Lisa found him sitting at the desk in his sparse room, reading financial documents. He looked up when she entered, but didn't stand or acknowledge her in any way. You took our college money, she said without preamble. I took my money that I'd saved for children who turned their backs on me. We were kids. You're not kids now. You're adults who've had 4 years to reconsider your position and chose not to. Lisa's hands clenched into fists. So you're going to punish us for the rest of our lives? I'm not punishing you. I'm simply treating you the same way you treated me, like strangers. I hate you. Leo finally looked at her directly. Good. That's easier than love. We tried to apologize. We tried to make things right. You try to ease your guilt. There's a difference. Lisa stared at her father for a long moment, seeing no trace of the man who'd once tucked her in at night and read her bedtime stories. You're not the same person. No, I'm not. Prison and betrayal have a way of changing a man. So that's it. You're just going to write us off completely. You wrote me off first. I'm just returning the favor. What if we'd never believed Mom? What if we'd stood by you from the beginning? Leo was quiet for a moment. But you didn't. And choices have consequences. Lisa turned to leave, then stopped at the door. For what it's worth, I am sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back 4 years of my life. Sorry doesn't undo the pain of sitting in a prison cell, knowing my own children thought I was a violent criminal. Then what would? What could we possibly do to make this right? Leo's smile was cold and final. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. After Lisa left, Leo sat in his room for a long time, feeling the weight of completed vengeance. Mercedes would go to prison, her life and reputation in ruins. Todd had fled the state and would likely spend his remaining years looking over his shoulder. Harold was dead, taking his guilt to the grave. His children had learned that betrayal carried a price that couldn't be paid with apologies or good intentions. Leo Burke had gotten his justice, complete, methodical, and final. But as he sat alone in his motel room, surrounded by legal documents and bank statements, Leo realized that vengeance was a cold companion. He'd spent 4 years planning this moment, and now that it was over, he felt empty. The family he'd once loved was gone forever. The business he'd built was destroyed. The life he'd lived for 39 years was ashes. Leo had won. He'd proven his innocence, exposed his enemies, and made them pay for their betrayal. So why did victory taste like dust in his mouth? Outside his window, Millbrook County went about its business, forever changed by the corruption that had been exposed. Leo Burke was free, vindicated, and wealthy from his civil settlement. He was also utterly, completely alone. And for the first time since his arrest, Leo Burke wondered if the price of justice had been worth paying. But it was too late for such thoughts. The choices had been made, the consequences accepted. Leo Burke had chosen the path of the unforgiving, and he would walk it alone until the end of his days. Justice, it turned out, was a harsh and solitary companion.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.